Information Network and BINnews.com.
Need an accident attorney by your side? All you got to do is call the accident guys.
Injured in a car accident or at work? Call the accident guys to speak with a real expert attorney for a free consultation.
Is this the tackle?
This is the KBLA Sports Minute with Ray Richardson.
The Rams failed to get into the end zone at Green Bay yesterday. They lose by 17. The Rams fall to 3-6. It's a Monday night game tonight for the Chargers. They're in New York to take on the Jets. The Chargers are trying to get to 500 at 4-4. USC fired defensive coordinator Alex Grinch, a move USC Nation had been calling for since last season. USC head coach Lincoln Riley had no choice. The move comes less than 24 hours after USC lost at home Saturday night to Washington 52-42. In the last 6 games, the Trojans defense has allowed 43.6 points per game. In their last 3, they have given up 1,581 yards in total offense. Saturday's loss dropped USC out of the AP Top 25 poll for the first time in Riley's 2 seasons at USC. No debates, no speculation, just the info you need. That's your KBLA Sports Minute. I'm Ray Richardson on KBLA Talk 1580.
KBLA Talk 1580 invites you to join us in celebrating the season of giving by being part of the solution. As we enjoy great food, family, warmth, and well wishes in whatever our festive tradition may be, we share the beauty of the season by reaching out to the less fortunate. Please help us to help others with the KBLA Cover the Houseless Cozy Community Coat and Blanket Drive. All you have to do is drop off new or clean, gently used winter coats and blankets in the KBLA lobby during business hours. Now through December 20th, all of the coats and blankets will be donated to unsheltered individuals and families experiencing houselessness. Simply bring your donation to 4434 Crenshaw Boulevard in Los Angeles, near Vernon Avenue, from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. weekdays. That's 4434 Crenshaw in historic Leimert Park. During the holidays and every day, let's remember, we keep us safe. We keep us warm. We are the safety net, and together we can cover the unsheltered. Get caught up in the spirit of the season, the spirit of love. Make a difference with your friends at KBLA Talk 1580.
Talking to the kids and the bicycle riders. Talking to the hippies and the Watergate hiders. Talking to the people getting down at the go-go. Shake a tambourine, go and get yourself a whistle and blow. Get it. Shake a tambourine and blow. Any kind of whistle, let's blow. Suck it to your biscuit and blow. Got a good diploma from a hippie school, y'all. Got a good religion, don't you be nobody's fool, y'all. Whoever got a dollar got more than me. I just wanna holler when my soul feel free. Now blow.
DC's Chuck Brown. Ain't nothing like a little DC go-go. In this hour, speaking of DC, our nation's capital, back in the day, we used to refer to it colloquially, if I can say that, at least, colloquially, as Chocolate City. That was back then. It ain't Chocolate City no more. That was when D.C. came to be the nation's murder capital and incarceration capital. But here's my question. Have you been to D.C. lately? D.C. ain't Chocolate City no more, as I said. It's now a haven for wealthy white people. The question is, how did that happen? And why is it that same reality is being replicated in major cities all across America? Here's the question. Do anti-black policy decisions drive mass incarceration, drive gentrification, and drive racial inequality? Tanya Golash-Boza's research draws a direct line between redlining, incarceration, and gentrification, and I'm pleased to have her on this program right now to talk about her new book and all things related. Tanya, good to have you on. How are you today?
I'm great. How are you? It's great to be here, Tavis.
Hey, it's great to have you on. I am well. If I complained, I'd be an ingrate. So I'm delighted to have you on and glad we have an hour for this conversation. Tanya's new book is called Before Gentrification. Before Gentrification, the creation of D.C.'s racial wealth gap. And we'll talk about D.C., of course, throughout this hour. Let me just start, Tanya, with this. As I said a moment ago, it appears to me, and anybody studying this or following this or watching this, that D.C. is not an outlier in this regard, that gentrification is as real as rain, and it's happening to chocolate spaces all across this country. Yes, no?
Yes, it's happened in D.C. and it's happening across the country. And in any city that had a significant great migration, African-American population is now seeing gentrification.
Mm-hmm. And broadly speaking, the reasons for that are what?
Well, if you think about it, so I'm in Washington, D.C., so, for example, we have a neighborhood west of the park called Chevy Chase, which is a historically white, upper-middle-class neighborhood. That neighborhood has never experienced gentrification. So if you think about any city that you lived in, there are some neighborhoods that have never been gentrified because they've always experienced lots of public investment, lots of private investment, so there's just no room for gentrification. So in order for gentrification to happen, you first have to have disinvestment. So you can only have gentrification when you have a neighborhood that experiences disinvestment, which means that the public and private sectors stop investing in that neighborhood and therefore make gentrification possible.
I never thought about it in that way. Let me just ask you a direct question about that, not out of any naivete. But how do we read the fact that all across this country, literally from California to the Carolinas, there are in fact neighborhoods that have never been gentrified? There are others that have been gentrified more than once, but there are some neighborhoods in this country that have never ever experienced the issue of gentrification. How do I read that in America?
Well, I mean, I can speak from Washington, D.C. So the Washington, D.C. has a small set of neighborhoods that were built for white residents and have always, ever since they were built, not always, because obviously before the land was occupied by Native Americans, but ever since they've been developed, as an urban area, it's been for whites. So in Washington, D.C., you see a very clear pattern where neighborhoods, whether they were built for black people or for white people, but once they see an influx of black people, they see disinvestment and they see policing. And that makes them ripe for gentrification. But a neighborhood a neighborhood in D.C. anyway, that remains all white, that remains all upper middle class, that neighborhood is just not possible to gentrify it, because gentrification literally means the gentry come. So if the gentry is already there, it can't be gentrified.
And in this context, I mean, I'm not naive. Of course, we know the definition of disinvestment. But in this context, in this conversation about gentrification, when you say disinvestment, unpack that for me.
So I'll tell you a quick story about the neighborhood that I grew up in, which is called Petworth in Washington, D.C. It was built for white residents in the early 20th century, and it was experienced public and private investment. The government built roads, built schools, built parks, and the private sector built homes. And they built all of this for white people, very specifically said, these homes have racial restrictive covenants in them, that you cannot sell them to people of color. And that neighborhood was 99% white. In 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that those racially restrictive covenants were not enforceable. And then in 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that the schools could not be segregated, so that black children could attend those historically white schools. And shortly after that, black people began to move into that neighborhood. So that shows you an example of a neighborhood that had once experienced very high levels of public and private investment. So there were delis, there were theaters, there were grocery stores, there were pharmacies, drugstores. As that neighborhood slowly became majority black, you stop seeing that flow of investment. So one very easy to see example of disinvestment is that the public school in that neighborhood, when it integrated, they closed the swimming pool. So that's an example of the city saying, now the school's integrated, we're going to close the swimming pool. We're not going to have a pool for that school because it serves black children. So that's a disinvestment. They're no longer investing in the school in a way that allows it to have a swimming pool.
There's a lot to unpack there, and starting with this notion of racially restrictive covenants and what that has to do with gentrification, what that has to do with disinvestment, and a lot more to unpack. What's happening in D.C., as I said earlier, is not an outlier, although her book is specifically about the nation's capital. As I said earlier, we used to call it Chocolate City. And if you've been there lately, that ain't exactly what it is. Still a significant black population, but certainly the power base and the neighborhoods are shifting and changing, and it ain't Chocolate City like it used to be. Her book is called Before Gentrification, The Creation of D.C.'s Racial Wealth Gap. A lot to unpack with our guest, Tanya Maria Golash-Boza. You're listening to her right now on Tavis Smiley.
More of Tavis Smiley when we come forward.
Escalade IQ. This the intro to the all-electric Cadillac perfection like Zoom. And on a full charge, you get 450 miles without the stop IQ. This is what I do. Daddy fat in the Lex since 92. Linked all the way back, panoramic roof. Come with 24-inch rim standard. Ooh, why? Shawty don't kill him. Cadillac diamond in the back, cold chillin'. And when I'm on attack, on the track is no ceiling. Sky's the limit. You hear me? Straight drop, no parachutes. Lay lines like a longitude and latitude. Feel it, beloved, clearly, we're hustling. Bustin', truckin'. Cadillac.
For more on the Escalade IQ, visit Cadillac.com.
Available late 2024. GM estimate 450-mile range. On a full charge based on development testing and/or analytical projection. Consistent with the CHA 1634 revision 2017 MCT. Range subject to change prior to production. Annual rates may vary based on service factors, including ambience temperature, terrain, battery age, and condition loading, and how you use and maintain your vehicle.
Do you have both Medi-Cal and Medicare?
If so, the new LA Care plan called Medicare Plus can help you get the most out of your health plan for $0.
LA Care provides personalized service to Angelinos like us.
Plus, it gives us access to doctors and specialists across Los Angeles County.
For zero cost, we get access to full benefits.
From vision coverage,
in-home support services,
to prescription drug coverage,
and a quarterly over-the-counter allowance,
plus personal equipment,
meal programs,
a gym membership,
and so much more.
For more than 25 years,
LA Care has provided Angelinos with access to quality health care at an affordable cost.
For our families,
our seniors,
our community,
it's a plus.
It's a plus
for all of us.
Anyone can choose to make a difference. You can help people succeed, rebuild after disasters, protect the environment, or feed the hungry. Not only will you make a difference for others, but for yourself. You can earn money for college, learn career skills, and make friendships that last a lifetime. Make a difference. Choose your future. Choose AmeriCorps.
Only 1 in 5 people with autism are employed, despite many having the skill set and desire to work.
Maybe it's because employers don't know what kind of jobs they can do. Like, what about a programmer?
That's a job for someone with autism.
How about a healthcare worker?
Yep, that is too. People with autism can do a lot of different jobs, but often get overlooked due to outdated stigmas. Introducing WIN by Autism Speaks. We help businesses lead the way in inclusive hiring.
What about a ranch hand?
To learn more, go to autismspeaks.org/win.
Helping to make you the most knowledgeable person in your circle of friends. This is Tavis Smiley.
Tavis Smiley in conversation with Tanya Golash-Boza. Her new book is called Before Gentrification, The Creation of D.C.'s Racial Wealth Gap. As I keep reiterating, it's not just D.C. happening all across the nation, but D.C. is a good exhibit A of how this stuff happens. So Tanya, let me come back to this point right quick before we move forward. And you were talking about the fact that for gentrification to even take place, it must be preceded by disinvestment. You can't have gentrification if there's no disinvestment to begin with. I take that point. But tell me more about whether or not these racially restrictive covenants, which have existed in cities all across this country, of course, whether or not one can pretty easily draw a straight line eventually, if not initially, eventually, one can pretty much, it seems to me, draw a straight line from racially restrictive covenants ultimately to gentrification. Yes, no, am I misreading that?
Okay, so what you want to think about is in the 1940s, we had racially restrictive covenants. Those were neighborhoods that were built for white residents. Mm-hmm. So with that idea, a neighborhood built for white residents is going to be a neighborhood that experiences a lot of public and private investment. So the covenants themselves kind of just set the neighborhood up as an all-white neighborhood. Mm-hmm. What happens next is determines whether or not gentrification is going to be possible. So a neighborhood like Chevy Chase, which is majority white, majority upper middle class, that was also built with racially restrictive covenants, as long as those covenants remain kind of unofficially enforced, like they're no longer legally enforceable, but as long as the neighborhood retains its character as an upper middle class white neighborhood, it will not experience gentrification. What makes gentrification possible is when Black people start to move into the neighborhood, and then the neighborhood experiences disinvestment. Because what happens is once the neighborhood becomes majority Black, then it becomes redlined, right? Which means that banks stop lending money to those establishments. So you see, for example, maybe there's a lot of theaters and delicatessens and stores and restaurants in a neighborhood when it's majority white. But once the neighborhood becomes majority Black, banks become less willing to loan money to those establishments, so the neighborhood starts to decline. And that's what makes it ripe for gentrification. So it's more like from the restrictive covenants to redlining to gentrification.
Yep. That's my point. You can eventually draw a line but from here to there. I take your point. Let me ask you right quick here whether or not, and we'll get to the private sector indictment. You just sort of laid that out about the banks and other institutions that redline these communities, insurance companies, et cetera, et cetera. We'll come to that, I promise. But is there a public sector indictment when it comes to the gentrification of D.C.? This is, of course, the space where there's taxation without representation. We know that story well. In D.C. and beyond, though, is there a public sector indictment before I do the private sector thing?
Yeah, so what happened in D.C. is as the city became majority Black, you mentioned it became Chocolate City. So 1970, Washington, D.C. was 70% Black. And in that same time, the public housing system was 98% Black, and the public school was about 95% Black. So once those public serving institutions became almost exclusively served the Black community, you saw a slow and steady public disinvestment from those resources. So yes, there was very strong public disinvestment. But what's interesting is as those entities, public schools and public housing, don't experience investment, as the city's not filling in potholes, as community programs are getting cut, as drug treatment programs are getting cut, all that is disinvestment. But in the mid-1980s, the city and the federal government decide, actually, we do want to invest in those majority Black communities. But that new investment was not in the schools, not in the public housing, not in the public resources, but instead in prisons and policing. So you have disinvestment followed by what I call carceral investment, which is when the city and federal government decides in these disinvested communities to now we're going to put resources, but those resources are going to be more policing, more prisons, more courts, just basically sending more people behind bars.
Back to my point earlier about taxation without representation, we all know that D.C. Even today doesn't get the respect it deserves in terms of federal representation, voting members in Congress, in the House, in the Senate. They don't have that. So to what extent did, with regard to D.C. specifically, the federal government look the other way during these Chocolate City years?
Well, they looked the other way for a little while, but once they started looking again, like looking back at D.C., so in the 1980s, we started having incidents where, violent crime started to rise because you have these decades of disinvestment that creates a scenario where all of a sudden you see a rise in crime. And once that crime started to spill over onto Capitol Hill, so you had a congressperson got carjacked. There were a couple of incidents that involved congressional aides or congresspeople. And then all of a sudden, D.C. has Congress's attention, and they actually mandated that D.C. hire more police. So Congress has control over D.C.'s laws and budgets. Like, we do have our own city council, but they have ultimate authority. So so Congress actually required Washington, D.C. to hire 1,500 more police officers.
You sort of tiptoed around this so far. Let me go right at it. I referenced at the top of this conversation that during those Chocolate City years, D.C. became the nation's murder capital and incarceration capital. And I remember that well because it was all sorts of politics about how the nation's capital could be the murder capital of these United States, the incarceration capital of these United States. How did that happen? How did D.C. become the murder and incarceration capital?
So if you have a city that experiences just decades of disinvestment, so what you want to think about is like in D.C. in the 1970s and 80s, the schools were just not getting the resources that they needed. The communities were not getting the resources they needed. There was a rising crisis of HIV/AIDS. There was rising levels of drug addiction. So the city was entering this kind of crisis period. Lots of people who were very poor. Public housing was being cut. So like lots of desperation in the city. And right at that time, around 1984, 1985, crack cocaine becomes available. Becomes something like it enters the market as an opportunity for people that are having a hard time to make a lot of money, and also people that are having a hard time to find an instant solve for their concerns. So crack cocaine it took D.C. by storm, and not just D.C., it also took Detroit, Los Angeles, other cities. But in D.C., it translated into a very lucrative market, and that lucrative market for crack cocaine led to high levels of violence. Different organizations, different criminal organizations started fighting for territory, and then also we had the widespread availability of handguns in the early 1990s. So all that kind of mix of high levels of poverty, lots of crack cocaine, and widespread availability of handguns kind of formed a cauldron in which emerged just a skyrocketing murder rate. So the murder rate, it hit about 400 murders in 1991, which was the highest rate in the history of D.C., but also at the time it was the highest murder rate in the country.
Mm-hmm. And yet you argue in this book that there were policies and policing that worked sort of in tandem to displace and to decimate the black middle class. And, of course, the reason this book is fascinating for me, and we have you on the program, is because there's a pattern here of anti-blackness, a pattern here of racial capitalism, not just in D.C., but in other places that I think has implications for all U.S. cities, if not now, certainly into the future. So tell me more about how these anti-black policies, as you refer to them, combined with policing, works to displace and, again, to use your word, decimate the black middle class in D.C. and beyond.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of times when people talk about the crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s, kind of people imagine this is primarily affecting the housing projects, it's primarily affecting, just areas of concentrated poverty. That's kind of the image that we get from the media. But in D.C., it definitely affected poor black communities. But what's really remarkable is the extent to which the heavy policing that came, in the aftermath of the crack epidemic, how it affected middle-class black communities. One statistic makes that clear. In 1997, 50% of black male youth in D.C. were caught in the grips of the carceral system, meaning that they were in jail, in prison, on probation, on parole, wanted on a warrant. So when you have 50% of young black male, that's not all poor people, right? Because only maybe about 25% of black people were poor at that time. So it's capturing a large swath of the community. So I started doing some research into this, trying to understand, where the police were targeting their efforts. And there was, if you were around in the 1980s and 1990s, you probably remember the RICO laws, the conspiracy laws that were used to put people away for long periods of time. So my research team and I looked at all of the instances where RICO laws were used to, quote unquote, take down drug organizations. And what we found was super interesting. The early applications of conspiracy laws in D.C., they did take down. There was this major drug distributor. His name was Rayful Edmond. He was like, everyone knew who he was in D.C., and they used conspiracy laws to take him down. And if you look at the records, it's like, okay, yes, Rayful Edmond was a major, major drug dealer. It's kind of like, it makes sense. Like, okay, you're going to use these big laws to take him down. But then we started looking at the cases that came after that, and they were all in working in middle-class black neighborhoods. They did not use those RICO conspiracy laws in the poorer neighborhoods. They used them in the middle-class neighborhoods, and they targeted people who had, they did not come up with a lot of evidence. Basically, they would sort of, when they started the case, they would say, We suspect this organization is moving millions of dollars of drugs, and then they do the big raid, and they come up with $10,000, $20,000. Just not anywhere near what Rayful Edmond was doing. But the sad part is that these raids led to hundreds of black men getting life in prison on drug distribution charges. So not on violent crime charges, just on drug distribution charges. And those black men, it was all men, and they were almost all in middle class, upper middle class black neighborhoods.
As I'm listening to you tell this story, my mind is going back to all the mayors of D.C. who I've known personally. I could run the list, and it's your hometown, so you know them. You know the list as well as I do. But all the way back to Marion Barry, I've had a chance to. I think there's probably not a single black mayor of D.C. since Marion Barry that I've not interviewed on one of my programs, television and radio, over the course of my career. So all of them, Marion Barry and Sharon Pratt and Anthony Williams, I mean, just run the list. All these black mayors I've had a chance to interview at some point. I raise that only because, as you well know, when the political right wants to blame us for our own situation, gentrification included, they point to the fact that all of these major cities where these issues exist oftentimes are led by African Americans. D.C. always led by black mayors. We sit for this conversation right now. The top 4 cities in this country all have black mayors: New York, Chicago, L.A., Houston. So and so we become accustomed to having black mayors in these cities, Detroit and Atlanta. I could do this all day long. You take my point. Is this reality, or these realities, in any way an indictment on the black leadership of these cities?
I mean, what I see when I look closely at this is trying to understand, okay, why did the police target these black middle-class neighborhoods? So we went in and looked at the community organization to see, what they're saying. And what we find, these black middle-class communities have more resources than poor black communities, so they're more likely to get together and organize, and they also are going to know people in political office, right? So if you look at what they're demanding, and also if you look at Marion Barry's record, if you look at Anthony Williams' record, all of them are going to be demanding better schools, more funding for community centers, fill the potholes, more drug treatment centers, and more police. What's interesting is that last call, as soon as they say, oh, and we want more police, then Congress is like, oh, yeah, sure, here's money for police. So what we see over and over again is, they're asking for all these things, and they're asking for police. I'm not going to, that's clear. Marion Barry says, the war on drugs is our number one priority, but he also says, and we need more resources in our community. But just that last call, that call for police is the one that gets answered.
And they ignore the other calls.
Yep, absolutely.
So is that your way of saying that it'd be unfair to indict these black mayors?
I don't know if it's unfair to indict them. I think they are in the helm of power. I think we want to think about they're operating within a broader context of white supremacy. So one black mayor can't fix this broader problem of white supremacy that we have.
And we raised this issue earlier, but I want to come to it one more time before we move forward here right quick. How much of this has to do with the fact that D.C. does not have statehood? I mean, these problems exist everywhere. But since your book specifically focuses on D.C., I wonder whether or not we'd be talking about this in the way that we are if D.C. if D.C. were in fact granted statehood, where it could do things that the federal government oftentimes ignores.
I think if D.C. had statehood, we would probably have some of the same problems, but it wouldn't be as exacerbated. The fact that D.C. is kind of under the realm of Congress the way that it is means that D.C. over and over again gets used as kind of like a testing ground for new policy. So those RICO cases, that they tested them out here first, and they have the authority to do that because it is the U.S. Attorney General, who, by the way, was Eric Holder at the time, who has the authority to basically practice, like they can test their experiments here, and you see that happening over and over again. So D.C. becomes a lab because of its status as a district and not a state. When
we come forward, we'll talk about the private sector complicity in gentrification and redlining and the like, which has led to, in D.C., the creation of a huge wealth gap and white rule, if I can put it that way. And again, I keep saying not just D.C. but other places. I'm having this conversation in part because I believe what's happened in D.C., what's happened there is instructive and informative for cities all across the country that are or certainly will be experiencing this in the years to come, even as we become a majority-minority nation. More with Tanya Golash-Bozer when we come forward on Tavis Smiley.
You're listening to Tavis Smiley. Tavis Smiley. Ranked number 45 on the Heavy 100 list of the 100 most important radio talk show hosts in America.
What's up, party people? It's your favorite MC's favorite rapper, MC Light here. And we're celebrating 50 years of hip-hop, authentically powered by Cadillac. And we're going to take it way back to where it started. It was only fitting that hip-hop began with teenagers at a back-to-school jam in the rec room of a South Bronx apartment complex by an 18-year-old brother. By the way, I'm also sure he had a Cadillac parked outside. He noticed the energy on the dance floor when he switched between two turntables, extending the beats, repeating the breaks, and never losing the rhythms. And that was the birth of hip-hop. And from that moment, it took off.
For more on how Cadillac is celebrating hip-hop's 50th, visit Cadillac.com/audacity.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Mike Moore. Here's the latest from the Black Information Network. New York Congressman George Santos, indicted on 23 criminal charges, isn't ruling out a plea deal. The truth-challenged GOP lawmaker is charged with lying on financial disclosure forms, misleading donors, using their credit cards without permission, and fraudulently collecting COVID unemployment benefits. Santos said he's not admitting anything but hasn't ruled out a plea deal if it should come his way. It hasn't so far. In California, Oakland is renaming a street in honor of African-American rapper Tupac Shakur. A stretch of roadway is now called Tupac Shakur Way. His early life was spent in Marin County, where his parents were involved in the Black Panther movement. The renaming comes 27 years after he was gunned down in Las Vegas, Nevada. And that's the latest. I'm Mike Moore from your 24/7 news source, the Black Information Network, and BINnews.com.
Need an accident attorney by your side? All you got to do is call the accident guys.
Injured in a car accident or at work? Call the accident guys to speak with a real expert attorney for a free consultation.
Is this the title? This is the KBLA Sports Minute with Ray Richardson.
The Rams failed to get into the end zone at Green Bay yesterday. They lose by 17. The Rams fall to 3-6. It's a Monday night game tonight for the Chargers. They're in New York to take on the Jets. The Chargers are trying to get to 500 at 4-4. USC fired defensive coordinator Alex Grinch, a move USC Nation had been calling for since last season. USC head coach Lincoln Riley had no choice. The move comes less than 24 hours after USC lost at home Saturday night to Washington 52-42. In the last 6 games, the Trojans defense has allowed 43.6 points per game. In their last 3, they have given up 1,581 yards in total offense. Saturday's loss dropped USC out of the AP Top 25 poll for the first time in Riley's 2 seasons at USC. No debates, no speculation, just the info you need. That's your KBLA Sports Minute. I'm Ray Richardson on KBLA Talk 1580.
We've got a lot to talk about.
Are you interested in catching up on all the latest entertainment news, trending topics, and exciting interviews? I got you. Tune in to The Raw Report with Robin Ayers, Monday through Friday, 6 to 7 p.m. I'm your host, Robin Ayers. Join me every weekday with some of the best entertainment contributors in the business as we break down what's going on, who's got next, and what not to miss. Only on The Raw Report with Robin Ayers.
Unapologetically progressive. KBLA Talk 1580. We've got your black. This is KBLA Talk 1580. Talk radio. That's music to your ears. We're unapologetically progressive. KBLA Talk 1580.
Hi,
Hi, I'm Kyle at Blindster.com. If you're like many people, you may think custom blinds is a job for expensive professionals. Well, at Blindster, if you have a tape measure and a screwdriver, you can install our custom blinds and save big. Plus, we guarantee they'll fit. Blindster.com.
Happy holidays, foodies. Les Affairs is your local Black-owned event planning and catering service you can trust to provide a Thanksgiving free of the holiday scaries. Find us at LesAffairsEvents.com. No grocery shopping in this haunting economy, laboring over a burning stove or battling the boogeyman, the dishes. Spooky season's over. Let Les Affairs cater your feast. Order from our selection of meats and sides delivered Thanksgiving Eve. Next day, heat, eat, and enjoy. Learn more at LesAffairsEvents.com or Instagram at LesAffairsEvents, LESAFFAIRESEVENTS. Bon appetit!
KBLA Talk 1580 is the exclusive media sponsor of This Light of Ours, activist photographers of the Civil Rights Movement. A dynamic new exhibition on view now at the Skirball Cultural Center in Los Angeles. This Light of Ours showcases more than 150 photos taken by movement insiders from diverse backgrounds that reveal the vital work undertaken by a broad coalition of organizers and everyday people whose collective action changed America. This Light of Ours is one of 3 temporary exhibitions currently on view at the Skirball, which together explore issues related to civil rights, immigration, and pluralism. Tickets and more information for all 3 exhibitions are available at skirball.org. That's skirball.org. SKIRBALL.org.
If you are a private individual or a small business owner who has had problems obtaining a business loan, credit card, or just even acquiring an apartment, please call Alliance Hillview LP for a free consultation at area code 510-459-6001. That's area code 510-459-6001. Remember, don't let your past determine your future.
Made fresh daily in Leimert Park, Los Angeles, California. You're listening to Tavis Smiley.
Tavis Smiley and Tanya Golash-Boza, who's the author of a new book called Before Gentrification, The Creation of D.C.'s Racial Wealth Gap, talking about the link between incarceration, gentrification, and racial inequality, not just in D.C., but beyond. It's a recipe for disaster, but D.C. is ground zero in Tanya's study of how these 3 things are just a combustible mix. Again, incarceration, gentrification, and racial inequality. To that end, Tanya, let me ask a few other questions as I press forward here. How would you define the ways in which mass incarceration doesn't just open the door to gentrification, but indeed scars Black communities for years on end?
Yeah, so mass incarceration devastates communities in multiple ways. So first of all, when you take a loved one from the home, I mean, it devastates the community. It devastates the family, right? So the family is going to be sad. It can. I'll give you an example. There was a story of a guy that I went to high school with. He was incarcerated. So when he was incarcerated, his sister, who was in college at the time, she had trouble focusing. She had trouble going to school because she's worried, because now her brother's facing life in prison. Mm-hmm. His mother is upset. She has trouble focusing at work. His grandmother is getting sick, and so these are all the kind of emotional impacts. But in that particular case, when he was arrested, the state actually forfeited his grandmother's house. Right? They argued that he was selling drugs out of the house, even though he was 25 years old and didn't live in the home anymore. So you have the state directly seizing assets from people. You have the family feeling devastated. You have people spending, and then when he got incarcerated in D.C., we don't have our own prison system, so he was sent hundreds of miles away. So now the family has to, if they want to see him, they have to travel hundreds of miles by train or by plane or by car to see them. So I mean, it's hard to say it quickly, but the effects on families are significant. The effects, and then you multiply that. That's just one family, right? So in that community, and there's many communities where 10% of young people were behind bars. So that's just many people taken out of a community, and the effects are just multiplied across the community.
Yep. Speaking of multiplied across the community, how do you read all these years later our ongoing predilection to use prisons to solve problems?
Yeah, I mean, we see it happening again right now. So right now, D.C. is changing a lot, but at the same time, we're seeing a rise in violent crime. So there's a real increase in homicides in Washington, D.C. It started during the pandemic, and we went from maybe 100 murders a year to now we're back up to 200. So we're not at the 400 where we were in the 90s, but this is again causing a moral panic. And, it just seems like everyone thinks, we're having a rise in crime. Prisons must be the solution. But there's really no evidence that prisons worked last time. But again, there's always this rush, in the United States, there's this rush to punish people. And particularly when the imagined perpetrators are African American, you see even more likelihood to say, oh my gosh, we need to put those people away. And you can see that also. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, you see it also. Finish your point. You can see it also what now?
Also, like if you think about how the response to the crack cocaine epidemic compares to the response to the opioid epidemic. So when it was crack, it was like, let's put everybody behind bars. When it was opioid, it's like, let's try and, help people. So there is a rush to incarcerate, but you particularly see that when the imagined perpetrators are black.
The problem is, even when the imagined perpetrators are black, to use your phrase, there are neoliberals who buy into these policies sometimes. And I was, again, going through your book and noting my friend Mark Lamont Hill's comments about resisting the contradictions and the consequences of neoliberalism and racial capitalism. Again, a combustible mix there. What say you about neoliberalism and racial capitalism?
Okay, so neoliberalism is just basically the idea that the state is no longer taking care of people. It punishes people, right? So we see that through and through in D.C. The state is cutting funding for schools, cutting funding for community centers, but pouring more money into punishing people and into incarcerated people. So that's neoliberalism. Neoliberalism is a form of capitalism, and racial capitalism is just pointing out that the way the state chooses to spend money, because the state obviously spends a lot of money. We just sent $14 billion to Israel. Like the state has a lot of money. The question is where they choose to send it, and those decisions are based on racism, right? Racism infuses the decisions that the state makes about where it's going to spend its funding. So that's why we say racial capitalism, because it's not just things are not just done in the name of profit. They're done very specifically. Race infuses those decisions.
Is this all about funding? And I ask that because whenever I'm in a conversation about the condition of our schools in the country, those who are critics of teachers' unions and those of us who are more progressive in our politics, the response is always, everything ain't about funding. It's not just about money. And there are other critiques that they want to level. So I ask in regard to this conversation, is it just about funding? Is it just about money?
The thing about schools, people often think that schools can fix everything. And no. No matter how much money you pour into the school, you're not going to fix everything through a school. Now, of course, I do believe schools should be funded better, but there's limits, right? So if kids are showing up to school hungry, you can give them 3 meals a day. But if kids are going home to a neighborhood or to a family that's not safe, right, they're going to come to school. They're not going to be able to learn. So, yes, there are definitely limits when we think about, funding schools. But there's also so much things that we could do if we invested in our communities in ways that truly uplifted them.
Yep. Let me ask a point-blank question. We started this conversation with me referring to D.C. as it was once referred to back in the day as Chocolate City. It ain't that these days, as I said earlier. If you've ever been there anytime recently, you'll know it ain't the Chocolate City that it used to be back in the 70s and 80s. But the subtitle of your book is The Creation of D.C.'s Racial Wealth Gap. What do we know about how bad, how significant, how broad the racial wealth gap is these days in our nation's capital?
Well, we know in 2016, and it's probably gotten worse since then, but a study was done in 2016 by Sandy Darity and some other folks, and they found that white people in D.C. have, on average, 81 times the wealth of black people.
Did you say 81?
I did say 81 times.
Man. I'm kind of stunned there. 81 times the wealth gap. Is indeed 81 times the wealth that black people have in D.C. That's astonishing. On that note, let me just say when we come forward, I have something else to say, but I need to process that for a moment to know what I'm going to say next. You're listening to Tavis Smiley.
Seeking the truth, speaking the truth. This is the Tavis Smiley Show.
What is dedication?
My biggest fear in the middle of my addiction was that my kids wouldn't have a father. And I started thinking, you know what? This isn't my story. I definitely had to become a better man to be a better father. It's important to me that my kids are empowered and truly believe that if they can think it, they can do it.
That's dedication. Visit fatherhood.gov to hear more. Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Ad Council.
Joey from Vermont, a farmer trying to get through the winter. Adriana from South Carolina, a single mother living paycheck to paycheck. Liam from Ohio, an injured father struggling to provide for his family. Hi, I'm Shanola Hampton, and I support the Feeding America network of food banks because they help provide over 6 billion meals to people in need each year. Learn more at feedingamerica.org.
The City of Los Angeles Civil Rights Department and its Reparations Advisory Commission are calling on you to be a part of something powerful. Join the Black Experience Study to share your experiences with the City of Los Angeles. We want to hear your stories. To join the study, join a focus group, or schedule an interview with us, visit www.blackexperiencela.com by December 31st. For more information, call 213-978-1845 or visit www.laisforeveryone.com.
KBLA Talk 1580. We've got a whole lot to talk about.
Hi, Maisha Cairo here, KBLA, live at Chase Bank on Crenshaw and Vernon for the In This Together tour with female business owners, a day of empowerment, community panels, and best of all, tips on building business from marketing to capital. Today I spoke with Tatiana, a community manager for JP Morgan Chase.
Thank you so much. Yes, my name is Tatiana Roberts. I am a community manager for JP Morgan Chase. I have to honestly say that this has been the most fulfilling position that I've ever had, where I get to give back to the community because I saw my mom's struggles. That's really what fuels what I do to make sure that the community has all the access to the resources that my mother didn't have.
So for the mother who's in business, what are 3 quick tips you can give to ensure that they're on the right path to accessing financial support from a bank like Chase?
Say number 1, just make sure that you're checking your credit on a consistent basis and taking action to either fix your credit, maintain your credit, or rebuild your credit. The second thing would be budget. I know that B word is kind of like ugly for, right? A lot of people don't like that B word, but it has to be done. We need to tell our money where to go. The last thing is to build a network of supporters that are going to lift you up.
The community building here in Crenshaw is that network. So visit the Chase Community Center on Crenshaw and Vernon. Meet a banker today. Tell them about your business. I'm Maisha Cairo in the community for KBLA with JP Morgan Chase.
Let's get back to more of this rich dialogue with Tavis Smiley.
All right, Tanya Golash-Bose, I picked myself up off the floor, and I'm still trying to process how it is that in the nation's capital, the racial wealth gap of white to black is 81 times. How is it that white folk in D.C. have 81 times more wealth than black folk in D.C.? How's that possible?
Yeah, well, it's about a century in the making, so that's how it's possible.
Yeah.
So we start with, a lot of people have argued that one of the main reasons behind the racial wealth gap is the gap in home ownership. But what's super interesting about Washington, D.C., is that we had a significant number of black homeowners in the 1960s and 1970s. So this is the era of white flight. So white people were leaving the city rapidly. Once the covenants were deemed unenforceable, once schools were integrated, 200,000 white people left the city. And we're not a big city. We had about 800,000 residents at the time. So as the city, so that opened up homeownership opportunities for black people, and a lot of black people were coming home from World War II and were veterans and were able to access VA loans. So they got nice homes, they got decent loans, at a 6% rate, which was the interest rate at the time. But what happened is that those black people who were able to purchase homes in D.C. in the 1950s, they purchased homes in neighborhoods that previously had been white, and they were nice neighborhoods with great schools at the time. But those neighborhoods experienced decades of disinvestment. So if you're African American and you bought a home in a majority black neighborhood in D.C. in the 1950s, the 1960s, the 1970s, or the 1980s, you wouldn't see any return on that investment because those homes didn't increase in value. Because as those neighborhoods got disinvested, the home values didn't increase. So they basically increased kind of at the rate of inflation. So you see a flat rate of increase between 1950 and 2000. So for 50 years in majority black neighborhoods. So even though there were large numbers of black homeowners, their assets weren't increasing in value. Meanwhile, people who had purchased homes in white neighborhoods, those houses were increasing in value much more rapidly. So that kind of sets the stage for the racial wealth gap. But that's not 81 times. That counts for part of it. But then you add on to that the fact that in the 1980s and 1990s, the schools in majority black neighborhoods, I mean, a lot of them had graduation rates of about 50%. So I mean, like half of people were not finishing college. And the labor market in D.C. is very much like if you have a college degree, if you have a master's degree, if you have an advanced degree, it's relatively easy to get a job right now. In D.C., if you have an advanced degree, the unemployment rate is like less than 2%. But if you don't have a high school degree, the unemployment rate is more like 20%, right? So sort of the failure to invest in schools for all those years created this large population of black people in D.C. who don't have a high school education. Then you add to that, the tens of thousands of young black men that went to prison. So they're also, when you go to prison, you're not earning any money, right? So that's all these decades of life when you're not building any wealth at all, right? Older people have a lot more wealth than younger people. But if you take 2 decades of earnings away from someone, that's 2 decades of opportunity to build wealth. So kind of all of those things combine to create the situation where black people have very little wealth in D.C. compared to whites.
It may have been 100 years in the making, but when you have a wealth gap that extreme, that white folk have 81 times more wealth than black people in any city, much less the nation's capital, that's not sustainable. I wrote a book about this with my friend Cornel West called The Rich and the Rest of Us. That kind of poverty, we argue in the book, threatens our very democracy. And I don't mean just in the nation. I mean in cities inside this country. I think democracy is threatened when the racial wealth gap is that broad. That kind of racial inequality is not sustainable long term. Never mind it being 100 years in the making. I digress on that for now. When we come forward, our remaining moments with Tanya Golash Boza on Tavis Smiley.
Hope, agency, dignity. This is Tavis Smiley.
If you're like me, 60 and retired, making ends meet, especially here at the supermarket and drugstore, is tough. I'm so blessed to have found benefitscheckup.org. It's a free and confidential website from the National Council on Aging that connected me to $1,200 a year in programs that help pay for food, medicine, utilities, and more. Maybe it can help you. benefitscheckup.org.
My daughter was diagnosed with a rare malignant rhabdoid tumor on the spine. They sent her straight to St. Jude. My hope was gone. But when you get there, everyone's like, hey, we're not going to give up. And when you see other people not giving up on your child, that makes all the difference in the world. When I found out I didn't have to pay, I was just grateful. They saved my baby's life.
Finding cures, saving children. Learn more at stjude.org.
KBLA Talk 1580. We've got a lot to talk about.
KBLA reminds you that when we fight, we win, and we don't black down. LA Community Action Network, or LA CAN, was formed in 1999 when 25 residents of downtown LA came together and acknowledged the problems that existed in their community and made a commitment to do something about those problems, to stand together, organize, and become a force in the community that demands change. Civil rights and preventing the criminalization of poverty are their core projects. In addition, they take on women's rights, the human right to housing, and healthy food access. LA Can also has projects focused on economic development, civic participation, voter engagement, and community media. While downtown LA remains their home base, with a particular emphasis on the Skid Row community, in 2007 they expanded their housing and healthy food access work into South Central Los Angeles. LA Can believes that power for low-income people and people of color is achieved through a large, active, and well-informed member base that utilizes a multitude of methods to advance their messages and goals. If you'd like to join the Los Angeles Community Action Network and organize people to fight back against oppression, please visit cangress.org. That's cangress.org. This is a community call to action from KBLA Talk 1580.
Discover, this is Danny.
Hi, it's Jen Coolidge. I just want to thank you for making me feel so special. I earned cash back on debit for my dinner party groceries.
That's great. But with Discover Cashback Debit, we give everyone cash back on everyday purchases. Anything else I can help you with?
Are you hungry? 'Cause everyone left after the asparagus sorbet.
Introducing Discover Cashback Debit, a checking account with cash back. It pays to Discover. Eligibility and terms at discover.com/cashback debit. Discover Bank, member FDIC.
Sounds different, huh? This is Tavis Smiley.
Just got a few minutes left in conversation, Tanya. Let me try to cover two things in these 3 minutes. Number one, we talked earlier about your indictment of the public sector when it comes to gentrification and the creation of the racial wealth gap in D.C. and, again, for that matter, other cities that are experiencing the same kind of fate. What's your indictment of the private sector?
I think the easiest way to see that is I was just saying how those housing values didn't increase for 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in the neighborhood there's 3 neighborhoods in D.C. That are adjacent to each other. That in 2016, Redfin announced that they were the top 3. They're 3 of the top 10 in the country for the amount of money that you could make from a home flip. And in that same article, the journalist actually wrote, the best home to buy is grandma's house. So they were literally saying, like, go in there, buy these homes that these people have lived in for 50 years, purchase them, fix them up a little bit, and flip them. So what you see there, though, is this extraction of wealth. So these homes have not increased in value for 50 years. People sell them. An investor comes along, buys them, invests, some money into it, and then flips it. So even though today the home values are increasing dramatically, most of that money is going to investors. Very little of that money is going to the long-term residents of the community.
Yeah. What's funny about that, and I don't mean ha-ha funny, is that you got Redfin, you got a major agency telling folk to do that. I mean, these are the good white folk telling you how to make a bunch of money. Go buy grandma's house from these Negroes, flip it, and you'll make a whole lot of money, and in the process gentrify these neighborhoods. I mean, it's just fascinating that kind of advice is coming from an entity like Redfin. I digress on that point. Here's my close. Speaking of flipping it, is there any way when it comes to gentrification in D.C. and beyond, any way when it comes to the expanding racial wealth gap in these cities, black versus white, that we can flip the frame, or is it too late? Is the damage already done?
I mean, we could go back to thinking, we, in the 1950s, the United States built public housing for people, like for tens of thousands of people. So there's no reason why we can't do that again. In the 1920s, the city took land away from black people to give to white people. There's no reason why they can't take that land back. So I think we could look at history from examples of relatively policy that we consider radical today, but that would have a huge impact by making housing a human right and not just a commodity.
I like that. Housing a human right and not just a commodity. Her name is Tanya Maria Golash-Boza. She's executive director of the University of California, Washington Center and professor of sociology at the University of California, Merced, the author of 5 previous texts, but this one that we've discussed for this last hour is called Before Gentrification, the Creation of D.C.'s Racial Wealth Gap. Enjoyed the conversation, learned a lot, Tanya. Thank you for your work, and thank you for the conversation. I appreciate you.
Thank you, Tavis. It was great to chat.
Great to have you on. Thank you for your time. When we come forward in our remaining hour of today's program, Jerry Mitchell, the founder of the Mississippi Center for Investigative Reporting and author of a book called Race Against Time, a reporter reopens the unsolved murder cases of the civil rights era. We'll talk about some high-profile black folk whose names you know, and the pressure, the demand to reopen many of these cases from the civil rights era to try to find some justice. Is justice delayed, justice denied? We'll talk about it with Jerry Mitchell when we come forward on Tavis Smiley.
KBLA 1580 Santa Monica.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Mike Moore. Here's the latest from the Black Information Network. New York Congressman George Santos, indicted on 23 criminal charges, isn't ruling out a plea deal. The truth-challenged GOP lawmaker is charged with lying on financial disclosure forms, misleading donors using their credit cards without permission, and fraudulently collecting COVID unemployment benefits. Santos said he's not admitting anything but hasn't ruled out a plea deal if it should come his way. It hasn't so far. In California, Oakland is renaming a street in honor of African-American rapper Tupac Shakur. A stretch of roadway is now called Tupac Shakur Way. His early life was spent in Marin County, where his parents were involved in the Black Panther movement. The renaming comes 27 years after he was gunned down in Las Vegas, Nevada. And that's the latest. I'm Mike Moore from your 24/7 news source, the Black Information Network, and BINnews.com.
Need an accident attorney by your side.
Green Bay yesterday, they lose by 17. The Rams fall to 3-6. It's a Monday night game tonight for the Chargers. They're in New York to take on the Jets.